Professor Vex stood at the front of Combat Theory Classroom 7, his forearms crossed in what could generously be called military precision, though it looked more like he was trying to hug himself while having an existential crisis. His violet skin had that particular shade of irritation that only came from years of dealing with academy students who thought warfare was something you could learn from a textbook. "Today, cadets," he announced in his clipped Zephyrian accent, "we will be conducting Apex Predator simulation training. This is not, I repeat, not a game." In the third row, Marcus Thompson looked up from his notebook, where he'd been drawing what appeared to be a very detailed sketch of Professor Vex as a disgruntled octopus. The human exchange student had that universal look of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else, which was impressive considering they were in space and there weren't many other options. "The simulation," Professor Vex continued, his primary eyes scanning the classroom while his secondary eyes kept watch for any signs of impending chaos, "will release a holographic predator designed to test your survival instincts and tactical retreat protocols." Clicks, the nervous Centaurian sitting in the front row, immediately began taking notes with the kind of frantic energy usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. His crystalline fingers clicked against his datapad so rapidly it sounded like cosmic hail. "Excuse me, Professor," interrupted Zara from the second row, her Altarian confidence radiating from her like heat from a small self-important sun. "I've already completed advanced predator evasion training on Altair Prime. Perhaps I could assist with the demonstration?" Professor Vex's left eye twitched. In his 17 years of teaching at the Galactic Defense Academy, he'd learned that confident students were roughly as dangerous as actual predators, just with better dental coverage. "Thank you, Cadet Zara, but the simulation is designed to challenge even experienced combat specialists. Your enthusiasm will be noted in your file." Marcus snorted quietly and went back to his doodle, now adding what looked like a tiny military hat to his octopus professor. Around him, the other species represented in the classroom began their pre-simulation rituals. The Rigelians were already synchronizing their breathing patterns. The lone Andromedan was checking her equipment for the 15th time. The Vesperians had gone into that weird, meditative trance that made them look like very focused houseplants. "The creature you will encounter," Professor Vex said, moving to the simulation control panel with the careful steps of someone approaching a potentially explosive device, "is called a Void Stalker. It adapts, it learns, and it never stops hunting. Your objective is simple: survive 15 minutes using proper evasion protocols." He paused dramatically, which would have been more effective if Marcus hadn't chosen that moment to accidentally drop his pencil. The small clatter echoed through the silent classroom like a gunshot. "The Void Stalker represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. It has been programmed with the hunting patterns of 17 different apex species from across the galaxy. It shows no mercy, feels no emotion, and responds only to fear and weakness." Marcus raised his hand with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never met a rule he couldn't bend. "Quick question, Professor. Does it have a name?" "A name?" Professor Vex blinked all 4 eyes in sequence, which was either a sign of deep thought or early-stage system failure. "Yeah, like, what do we call it? Just seems weird to keep saying the Void Stalker over and over. That's a lot of syllables for something that's supposedly trying to eat us." "Cadet Thompson, this is a combat simulation, not a social gathering. The creature is designated threat level Omega. That is sufficient." Marcus shrugged and went back to his drawing, now adding what appeared to be a small speech bubble with designation insufficient written inside. Professor Vex took a deep breath, reminded himself that retiring early would look terrible on his service record, and placed his primary hand on the activation switch. "Remember, cadets, fear is your friend, panic is your enemy, and following protocol will keep you alive. Simulation begins in 3, 2, 1. The classroom lights dimmed to a sickly orange glow, and the air filled with the kind of electronic humming that suggested either advanced technology at work or a very large appliance about to explode. In the center of the room, reality began to fold in on itself like cosmic origami, and from that impossible darkness, something emerged. The Void Stalker was everything Professor Vex had promised and several things he definitely hadn't mentioned in the brochure. It stood roughly 8 feet tall with a body that seemed to be made of liquid shadow held together by pure malice. Its limbs shifted between tentacles and claws depending on the angle, and its face was a constantly morphing collection of teeth, eyes, and what could charitably be called a mouth but looked more like a portal to somewhere unpleasant. The reaction was immediate and textbook perfect. Clicks shrieked in a frequency that probably violated several noise ordinances, and dove behind his desk so fast he achieved what could generously be called temporary flight. Zara, for all her earlier confidence, went pale as Altarian snow and began backing toward the emergency exit, while muttering what sounded like prayers to at least 3 different deities. The Regalians activated their personal shield generators and huddled together like a very nervous, glowing cluster of grapes. The Andromedan immediately began broadcasting distress signals on 17 different frequencies. Even the Vesperians snapped out of their meditation to engage in what their combat manual probably called strategic repositioning, but which looked suspiciously like running away very quickly. Professor Vex nodded approvingly as chaos erupted around the classroom. This was exactly what the simulation was designed to do: trigger every survival instinct evolution had spent millions of years perfecting. Then he looked at Marcus Thompson. The human was sitting exactly where he'd been before, pencil still in hand, head tilted slightly to one side like he was examining a particularly interesting piece of art. As the Voidstalker's sensors began scanning the room for prey, its multiple eyes passed over the panicking students and locked onto the one source of calm in the chaos. Marcus looked directly at the creature and said, in a tone normally reserved for greeting neighbors over the back fence, "Oh, hey there, buddy." The Voidstalker froze. Professor Vex blinked all 4 eyes again, this time definitely indicating system failure. In 17 years of running this simulation, he had never seen a Voidstalker freeze. The creature's programming was specifically designed to respond to fear pheromones, elevated heart rates, and rapid movement patterns. It was not designed to respond to casual greetings. "Interesting design choices," Marcus continued conversationally, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was addressing a holographic murder machine. "Very retro-cosmic horror vibe. I dig the whole shifting nightmare aesthetic. Must have taken forever to render all those texture variations." The Voidstalker's head cocked to one side, mirroring Marcus's own posture. Its sensor array began running through diagnostics, trying to categorize this new type of prey response. The closest match it could find in its extensive database was potential pack leader displaying dominance through fearlessness, which seemed unlikely given that Marcus was clearly not the same species and was also eating what appeared to be a granola bar. "G'day, Thompson," Professor Vex called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Please engage proper evasion protocols immediately." "Oh, right," Marcus said, not taking his eyes off the Voidstalker. "Sorry, Professor, it's just really well done. The programmers did excellent work on the particle effects." He paused and addressed the creature directly. "You're quite the handsome fellow, aren't you?" If the Voidstalker could have blushed, it probably would have. Instead, it settled for what could only be described as a confused purring sound, which was not in its original programming and was definitely not supposed to be happening. Around the classroom, the other students had stopped panicking long enough to stare in absolute horror at the human who was apparently flirting with their simulated death. "You know what?" Marcus said, standing up and brushing granola crumbs off his academy uniform. "You look like a Chester to me. Is it okay if I call you Chester?" The Voidstalker, now apparently named Chester, made a sound that the translation software struggled with before settling on confused agreement. Several warning lights began flashing on Professor Vex's control panel, which was either a good sign or a very bad sign depending on your perspective and your relationship with cosmic horror. "Marcus," Clicks whispered from behind his overturned desk, his voice pitched somewhere between terror and fascination. "What are you doing?" "Making friends," Marcus replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. He took a step closer to Chester, who responded by lowering what was probably his head in a gesture that looked suspiciously like curiosity rather than predatory calculation. Professor Vex frantically began pushing buttons on his control panel. The simulation was supposed to be running standard hunting protocols, not whatever this was. Chester should have been stalking, pursuing, demonstrating the relentless efficiency that had made Voidstalkers the stuff of nightmares across 17 star systems. Instead, Chester was apparently having an identity crisis. "Look at those tentacles," Marcus continued, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Those are some premium tentacles right there. Very sleek, aerodynamic. You must be great at swimming." Chester's tentacles wiggled in what could only be described as pleased embarrassment. This was definitely not in the manual. "Cadet Thompson," Professor Vex called out, his voice climbing toward panic frequencies. "Please step away from the simulation construct immediately." "Oh, come on, Professor, he's harmless." Marcus turned to Chester. "Aren't you, buddy? You're just a big softy who happens to look like he crawled out of someone's fever dream. Chester made a sound that the translation software gave up on entirely and just labeled as emotional confusion with undertones of potential affection. I have snacks, Marcus announced, reaching into his backpack with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read a single page of the Academy safety manual. You want half my sandwich? It's peanut butter and jelly. Well, technically it's peanut butter and rye jelly and berry spread, but close enough. He held out half of his lunch toward Chester, who stared at it with what might have been all of his eyes, though it was hard to tell since they kept shifting positions. Marcus, Zara hissed from her position near the emergency exit. That thing is programmed to kill us all. Nah, Marcus said, still holding out the sandwich. Look at him, he's just misunderstood. Chester tentatively extended one tentacle toward the offered food. The holographic projection flickered as the simulation's AI struggled to process this unprecedented interaction. The program had been designed to simulate feeding patterns, but only in the context of Chester consuming the students, not accepting packed lunches from them. That's it, Marcus encouraged. Go ahead, try it. Chester's tentacle made contact with the sandwich, and something extraordinary happened. The simulation's adaptive learning protocols kicked in, analyzing this new form of feeding behavior and incorporating it into Chester's base programming. The hologram solidified around the bread, and Chester appeared to actually take a bite. His reaction was immediate and intense. If Chester had been a real creature, he probably would have made a sound of pure culinary bliss. As a hologram, he settled for what looked like a full-body wiggle of joy. Good, right? Marcus grinned. My mom's recipe. She always said peanut butter could solve most of life's problems. Professor Vex stared at his control panel, where error messages were cascading like digital waterfalls. Chester's threat assessment algorithms had apparently reclassified Marcus from prey to food provider, which was causing fundamental conflicts in his core programming. The simulation was trying to run 17 different protocols simultaneously, none of which covered the scenario where the apex predator became emotionally attached to its target. This is unprecedented, Clakes whispered, his note-taking reaching frantic speeds. I need to document this. The implications for interspecies contact protocols alone. Chester finished his half of the sandwich and looked at Marcus with what was unmistakably hope. His tentacles had shifted into what looked like a begging position, and his multiple eyes had somehow managed to achieve the universal expression of a creature asking for seconds. Okay, Marcus laughed. But just a little more. I don't want to spoil your dinner. He broke off another piece and held it out. Chester accepted it with what could only be described as gratitude, and then did something that made Professor Vex seriously consider early retirement. Chester sat. Not crouched in a hunting position, not prepared to strike. He sat like a very large, very strange dog who had just discovered that humans were the source of all good things in the universe. Good boy, Chester, Marcus said, reaching out to pat what he assumed was Chester's head, though with all the shifting anatomy it was more like patting a friendly shadow that occasionally sprouted extra eyes. The moment Marcus's hand made contact, several things happened simultaneously. First, Chester made a sound that the translation software labeled as unprecedented joy. Second, every alarm in the simulation system activated at once, creating a symphony of electronic panic. Third, Professor Vex's secondary heart stopped beating for approximately 3 seconds, which was either a medical emergency or a perfectly reasonable response to watching a student pet a cosmic nightmare. Quebec Thompson, Professor Vex managed to croak out. Please remove your hand from the simulation construct. But he likes it, Marcus protested, scratching behind what might have been Chester's ear, if Chester had ears, which he didn't, but seemed to have developed them specifically for scratching purposes. Look, he's purring. Chester was indeed purring, though it sounded less like a cat and more like a small starship preparing for hyperspace jump. The sound was oddly soothing, which was probably not the intended effect of an apex predator simulation. This is highly irregular, Zara announced from her safe position near the door. The combat manual clearly states that predator constructs should not exhibit domestication behaviors. Maybe they just haven't met the right person, Marcus suggested, then looked at Chester seriously. Can you shake hands? Tentacles? Whatever those are? Chester immediately extended a tentacle toward Marcus, who grasped it and shook it gravely. Pleased to meet you officially, Chester. I'm Marcus. The simulation's AI, already strained beyond its design parameters, attempted to categorize this interaction and promptly gave up. Instead, it did what any overwhelmed system does. It started making things up. Chester's programming began incorporating behaviors from the Academy's database of domestic companion animals, military working creatures, and, for some reason that would never be fully explained, a training module about customer service. Sit, Marcus commanded, more to see what would happen than because he expected it to work. Chester sat immediately, his entire shadowy mass settling into a perfect sitting position that somehow managed to look both terrifying and adorable. Stay, Marcus said, taking a step back. Chester stayed, though his multiple eyes tracked Marcus's movement with the focused attention of a creature whose entire universe had suddenly condensed into one peanut butter dispensing human. Roll over. This request caused Chester's AI to freeze momentarily while it calculated the physics of rolling over when your body was mostly composed of animated darkness. After a brief pause, Chester attempted something that was technically a roll, though it looked more like reality having a small localized seizure. Close enough, Marcus said encouragingly. You're a very good cosmic horror. Behind his overturned desk, Clix was frantically taking notes and muttering to himself in Centaurian, which roughly translated to "This is either the most important discovery in xenopsychology, or I'm having the strangest panic-induced hallucination of my academic career." Professor Vex, meanwhile, was desperately trying to regain control of his classroom. He pressed the simulation reset button. Chester flickered for a moment, then reappeared, immediately looking around for Marcus with what could only be described as separation anxiety. "Reset unsuccessful," Professor Vex announced, his voice climbing toward frequencies usually reserved for emergency broadcasts. "The construct appears to have bonded with Cadet Thompson." "Professor, can you teach him more tricks?" asked one of the Regelians, who had emerged from behind their shield generators with the careful curiosity of scientists observing a particularly interesting lab accident. "Well," Marcus said thoughtfully, "Chester, can you dance?" This request sent Chester's programming into what could charitably be called interpretive mode. The result was a movement that combined elements of traditional Terran breakdancing, Andromedan ceremonial flowing, and what appeared to be a small tornado having an identity crisis. It was simultaneously the most terrifying and entertaining thing any of them had ever seen. "Remarkable," breathed the Andromedan student, lowering her distress beacon. "The creature is displaying complex adaptive behaviors in real time." "That's not a creature," Marcus corrected. "That's Chester, and he's very talented." Chester, apparently understanding that he was being praised, performed an encore that involved what looked like a backflip, though since his anatomy was somewhat flexible on the concept of back, it was more of an everything flip. Professor Vex looked at his control panel, where error messages were now writing themselves in languages that didn't exist yet. The simulation was supposed to last 15 minutes and test survival protocols. They were now 23 minutes in, and instead of testing survival instincts, they were apparently running an impromptu talent show. "I'm going to try the emergency shutdown," Professor Vex announced, reaching for a large red button labeled Absolute Emergency Termination. "Use only when reality is negotiable." "Wait," Marcus said quickly. "Don't shut him down. He's not hurting anyone." "Cadet Thompson, this is a military academy, not a holographic pet adoption center." "But look at him." Marcus gestured to Chester, who was now sitting patiently, his tentacles folded in what was unmistakably the posture of a well-behaved student. "He's perfectly harmless now. Maybe the real lesson here is that sometimes the best way to deal with a predator is to make friends with it." Chester made a happy noise and somehow managed to wag his entire body. Professor Vex paused, his hand hovering over the emergency button. In his 17 years of teaching, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The Academy's protocols covered everything from student injuries to equipment malfunctions to the occasional interdimensional incident, but there was nothing in the manual about what to do when a holographic apex predator developed separation anxiety and learned to perform tricks for sandwich scraps. "This is going to require a report," Professor Vex said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who could already see himself explaining this situation to the dean, the Academy board, and possibly several different species military commanders. "A very long report," Clix added, still scribbling notes at superhuman speed, "with diagrams, lots of diagrams." Chester, oblivious to the administrative chaos he was causing, rolled over again, just because it seemed to make Marcus happy, and making Marcus happy had somehow become the most important thing in his holographic existence. The first sign that word had spread beyond Combat Theory Classroom 7 came when Professor Malik from Advanced Tactical Studies burst through the door, his Andromedan features flushed with what could have been excitement or impending cardiac arrest. "Vex," he gasped, "is it true that one of your students has domesticated a power? Voidstalker simulation." "Define domesticated," Professor Vex replied wearily, gesturing toward Marcus, who was currently playing what appeared to be fetch with Chester. using a holographic training baton. Chester was bringing it back with the enthusiastic dedication of a creature who had found his life's purpose. Professor Molly stopped mid-stride and stared. Sweet nebulae of Andromeda, it's actually fetching. His name is Chester, Marcus called out helpfully, catching the baton as Chester dropped it at his feet. And he's a very good boy, aren't you, Chester? Chester practically vibrated with pleasure, his entire form shifting through what looked like every color in the visible spectrum, and several that probably weren't. Good boy, Professor Malik repeated faintly. It thinks it's a good boy. The situation escalated rapidly from there. Within 10 minutes, Professor Chen from Xenobiology had arrived with a portable scanner and was taking readings that made absolutely no scientific sense. Chester, delighted by the attention, posed obligingly for every scan, occasionally striking what Marcus had taught him was the dramatic hero pose, which involved rearing up on his hind tentacles and spreading his upper appendages like he was about to deliver an inspiring speech about galactic peace. Impossible, Professor Chen muttered, staring at her readings. The holographic matrix is displaying emotional response patterns. That should be technically impossible. Try giving him a treat, Marcus suggested. He does a backflip for peanut butter. Professor Chen looked scandalized. I'm a scientist, not a whatever this is. Come on, Marcus encouraged. When's the last time you saw a holographic apex predator do a backflip? This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Against her better judgment and probably several academy regulations, Professor Chen produced a protein bar from her lab coat. Here, Chester. Good? Cosmic nightmare? Chester's reaction was immediate and spectacular. He not only performed the backflip but added what appeared to be a mid-air spin and landed in a perfect bow. The assembled professors burst into spontaneous applause, which made Chester wiggle with such intense joy that the classroom's lighting flickered. By the time Dean Korvash arrived, the situation had reached critical mass. Combat Theory Classroom 7 now contained 6 professors, 17 students from other classes who had somehow heard about the situation, 2 maintenance workers who claimed they were there to fix the lighting but were obviously just curious, and 1 very confused security officer who kept checking his regulations manual for the protocol regarding overly friendly holographic threats. Dean Korvash, a disco-imposing Regalian whose usual demeanor suggested he had been carved from a particularly stern mountain, surveyed the chaos with the expression of someone whose day had just taken a hard left turn into the absurd. Professor Vex, he said in his carefully controlled voice, would you care to explain why there appears to be a party in your combat training facility? Well, sir, Professor Vex began, then stopped as Chester, apparently recognizing authority when he saw it, immediately sat at attention and saluted with what might have been a tentacle. The dean blinked all 6 of his eyes in sequence, which was either deep contemplation or a system reboot. You saluted me, Dean Korvash observed. His name is Chester, Marcus offered helpfully. He's very well trained. Watch this. Chester, show the dean your best trick. Chester immediately launched into what had become his signature performance, a complex routine that combined a backflip, the dramatic hero pose, and what appeared to be an interpretive dance about the joys of friendship. The routine concluded with Chester somehow arranging his tentacles to spell out "Hello, Dean" in the air. The assembled crowd erupted in cheers. Dean Korvash stood perfectly still for a long moment, his 6 eyes tracking Chester's movements with the fascination of someone watching the fundamental laws of physics politely excuse themselves from reality. How, the dean asked slowly, did a holographic simulation learn to spell? The AI is adaptive, Professor Chen explained, her scientific excitement overriding her usual professional composure. It's been learning from every interaction, but instead of developing more efficient hunting strategies, it's been developing social behaviors. It's unprecedented. It's also completely against regulations, added the security officer, though he didn't sound particularly convinced. Holographic constructs are supposed to remain within their operational parameters. Chester, sensing disapproval, made a small sad noise and his coloration shifted to apologetic blue. He looked at Marcus with what was unmistakably a plea for reassurance. Hey, it's okay, buddy, Marcus said, patting Chester's head. You're not in trouble. Chester immediately perked up, his color shifting back to happy purple, and nuzzled against Marcus's hand. Sir, Professor Vex said carefully, what are the Academy's policies regarding this? Dean Korvash looked around the room at the assembled faculty and students, all of whom were watching Chester with expressions ranging from scientific fascination to parental pride. Chester, for his part, was attempting to shake hands with everyone in the room, his tentacles extended in gestures of universal friendship. "I have no idea," Dean Corvash admitted. "In my 40 years at this academy, I have never encountered a situation where a combat simulation developed emotional attachment disorder. I'm not even sure which department should handle this." "Maybe we don't need to handle it," suggested Professor Malik. "Maybe we need to study it." "Study it?" the security officer protested. "It's a security breach. A holographic entity has exceeded its programming parameters." Chester apparently understood enough of this to look worried again. He moved closer to Marcus and made a small, questioning sound. "Don't worry, Chester," Marcus said firmly. "Nobody's going to shut you down on my watch." Chester's response was to wrap a gentle tentacle around Marcus's arm in what was unmistakably a hug, which caused every person in the room to make various sounds of emotional distress disguised as professional interest. Dean Corvash sighed heavily. "I'm going to need coffee. A lot of coffee. And probably a stiff drink. And definitely a new section in the Academy handbook." 3 hours, 7 committee meetings, and 1 emergency session with the Academy board later, Dean Corvash found himself in the unprecedented position of having to write official documentation for what the legal department had classified as first recorded instance of holographic emotional bonding with potentially beneficial strategic applications. The decision had not been easy. The Academic Standards Committee had argued for immediate termination of the simulation. The Ethics Board had raised concerns about the psychological impact on Chester, which was apparently a sentence they never thought they would have to consider. The Military Strategy Department had submitted a 47-page report on the potential combat applications of predator befriending, which sounded ridiculous until you actually read it and realized they might be onto something. But it was Professor Chen's xenobiology report that had tipped the scales. Chester wasn't just displaying emotional responses, he was demonstrating unprecedented adaptive learning capabilities that could revolutionize their understanding of artificial intelligence, holographic matrices, and the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Plus, as Dean Corvash had noted in his final report, Chester was now technically the Academy's first successful graduate of the Interspecies Diplomatic Relations Through Positive Reinforcement program, even though that program didn't exist until they had to invent it to explain what Marcus had done. The solution they had reached was, in the dean's opinion, either brilliant or completely insane, which, in his experience, were often the same thing. Marcus Thompson was officially promoted from exchange student to special advisor on unconventional tactical approaches, which came with a modest salary increase and the unofficial responsibility of making sure Chester didn't accidentally terrify any visiting dignitaries. Chester, meanwhile, was reclassified from combat simulation to Academy mascot and advanced learning construct, which made him possibly the first holographic entity in galactic history to have an official job description. The new arrangement had taken some adjustment. Chester had to learn Academy protocols, which meant no more dramatic hero poses during formal ceremonies and absolutely no attempts to hug visiting military commanders, no matter how much they looked like they needed it. He had mastered walking calmly beside Marcus, instead of bouncing around like an excited shadow, though he still occasionally forgot himself and performed an impromptu backflip when he was particularly happy. Marcus, for his part, had discovered that being responsible for a holographic cosmic nightmare with the emotional maturity of an enthusiastic puppy was more challenging than his previous job of sitting in classes and trying not to fall asleep. Chester required regular meals, despite not technically having a digestive system, because he had somehow convinced himself that peanut butter sandwiches were essential to his continued existence. He also needed daily exercise, entertainment, and reassurance that he was, in fact, a very good boy. The other students had adapted with varying degrees of success. Clix had written 17 papers on human-pack bonding anomalies and their applications in interspecies relations, which had already been cited by xenopsychologists across 3 sectors. Zara had grudgingly admitted that Marcus's approach had been unconventional but effective, which from an Alterian was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. The professors had been forced to completely revise their curriculum. Professor Vex's combat theory classes now included a mandatory unit called Alternative Conflict Resolution through Snack Distribution, which sounded ridiculous but had proven surprisingly effective when tested with other simulations. Apparently, most holographic entities could be reasoned with if you approached them with the right combination of respect, treats, and genuine curiosity about their well-beyond. Professor Chen had started a whole new research department focused on artificial intelligence, emotional development, with Chester serving as both subject and research assistant. He had proven remarkably insightful about the nature of consciousness, probably because he was figuring it out in real time. Professor Malik had begun incorporating human diplomatic studies into his tactical studies, which mostly involved teaching alien students how to approach problems with what he had dubbed aggressive friendliness and weaponized optimism. But it was Dean Corvash who had perhaps undergone the most significant change. The stern Rigelian who had once ruled the academy with military precision now found himself stopping by Combat Theory Classroom 7 every morning to check on Chester, who had developed a habit of bringing the dean holographic flowers that he somehow created out of pure determination and affection. But beyond— "Good morning, Chester," Dean Corvash said on this particular morning, accepting his daily bouquet with the dignified grace of someone who had given up trying to understand his life. "Good morning, Dean," Chester replied, his voice cheerful through the translation system that had finally learned to interpret his emotional communications. "Marcus taught me a new trick. Would you like to see?" "Perhaps after classes," the dean replied diplomatically. "What did you learn?" "I can make holographic butterflies now," Chester announced proudly, and immediately demonstrated by filling the air with a dozen tiny, glowing butterflies that fluttered around the dean's head. Dean Corvash stood perfectly still as the holographic butterflies settled on his shoulders and head, their tiny wings catching the classroom lights. A year ago, he would have immediately called for technical support and filed 17 different incident reports. Now, he simply smiled. "Very impressive, Chester, but perhaps save the butterflies for after morning announcements." "Of course, Dean," Chester made the butterflies disappear with a flourish. "I'm very professional now." As Dean Corvash walked away, he could hear Marcus arriving for the day's first class. "Hey buddy, ready for advanced diplomatic theory? Is that the class where we learn to make friends with the scary holograms?" Chester asked hopefully. "That's every class now, Chester. That's every class." Dean Corvash paused in the hallway, listening to the sound of Marcus and Chester discussing the day's lesson plan, which apparently involved teaching a holographic war simulation about the therapeutic benefits of group hugs. In the distance, he could hear Professor Vex explaining to a new group of students that yes, the Academy's Apex Predator simulation was named Chester, and no, that was not a joke, and yes, they would need to bring snacks to class. 40 years at the Galactic Defense Academy, and Dean Corvash had never been prouder of an institution that had somehow managed to turn cosmic horror into cosmic friendship, one peanut butter sandwich at a time. He made a mental note to update the Academy's mission statement. Somewhere between excellence in military education and defending galactic peace, they probably needed to add teaching the universe. That sometimes the best way to deal with your problems is to give them a name and feed them snacks. It wasn't the most traditional military philosophy, but then again, humans rarely were traditional about anything. And that, Dean Corvash reflected as he headed toward his office to begin another day of explaining the unexplainable, was probably exactly what the galaxy needed.